Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on commercialization of cell and gene therapy. I'm your host and moderator, Shridhar Narayanan, Senior Technical Advisor at the Indian Pharmaceutical Alliance. This webinar is jointly hosted by Citeline and the Indian Pharmaceutical Alliance. From Chimera to next CAR-T, there has been significant advances in the last 7 to 10 years in the area of cell and gene therapy, especially CAR-T therapy. There have been significant advances in this field, though some of the manufacturing, accessibility, and cost challenges still remain. What we intend to do today is to give you a bird's eye view of the global landscape of cell and gene therapy, followed by opportunities that exist in India, and then zoom in on a case study on the next CAR T-cell therapy from ImmunoAct. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Pooja Rana. Pooja Rana has extensive experience in commercialization and life cycle management consulting for specialty and complex therapeutics across therapeutic areas, including cell and gene therapy. Her areas of expertise include distribution, procurement, model strategy, reimbursement and therapy, economic modeling, site selection and certification approach, provider site training, and activation planning. Pooja studied cell biology and neuroscience during her bachelor's degree at Rutgers and also graduated with a master's degree in public health from Yale University. It's my pleasure to welcome Pooja Rana. Over to you, Pooja.
Great. Thank you for that introduction. My name is Pooja Rana. I'm a senior consultant at the Dedham Group, which is part of the Norcell Citeline overall company. Great. So first, I wanted to talk a little bit about the landscape as we know it today. On the left-hand side, we see in terms of the assets that are marketed, most companies have, one or so assets really on the market, with a couple of those larger companies having multiple assets on the market. And then when we think at look at the preclinical and clinical stage assets, we really see a lot of saturation in terms of companies who are really trying to break into this landscape. We can go to the next slide. And then before we start talking about the marketed assets and their threats and challenges that are associated with each of them, it's important for us to first acknowledge the different types of products that exist. So when we think about autologous therapies, when we think about autologous cell therapies, we have our CAR-Ts, Abecma, Kymriah, Yescarta, and then we have the newer autologous gene therapies, Casgevy, Lyfgenia, Zynteglo. And then when we think about allogeneic therapies, we have Abvalo, which is a recent approval in the EU, as well as our more standard in vivo gene therapies, which are our AAV assets like Elevidys, Hemgenix, things like that. So on the next slide, we really want to get into what are some of the challenges when it comes to commercializing these products. So, starting at the top here, we have longer manufacturing times. This is really associated with those autologous cell therapies. Those are patient specific. So when it comes to manufacturing, it's going to be done on a per patient basis, which is also a lot of challenges and delays that can happen when in the manufacturing process. Along with that, since you do have the patient involved in the manufacturing timeline, there's a lot more coordination that's needed across the treatment journey. So when we talk about coordinating the patient coming in, collecting the cell materials, things like that, the hospital really does have to handle all of those responsibilities, resulting in a lot of strain on their resources. And additionally, the longer inpatient stay as well is associated with that autologous cell and gene therapy. So since there's a longer inpatient stay, that's also going to result in higher costs associated with that treatment of that product. And then the next thing here, really focus more on the autologous gene therapy. There is that potential for significant side effects and AEs associated with that conditioning therapy. There are also AEs associated, obviously, with the autologous cell therapies, but when it comes to gene therapy, that conditioning therapy is really challenging in the setting of the hospital. Next, getting into the allogeneic cell therapies, one of the challenges there is, since it's allogeneic by nature, there is that potential requirement of HLA and batch matching, which can limit the eligibility of patients who can qualify for that therapy. And then these last couple in general sort of apply across all of them. So thinking about the infrastructure that needs to be developed. So inpatient, outpatient infrastructure for these therapies is quite extensive. You need staff that's an expert in this. You need the availability of inpatient beds, particularly in the ICU, being able to watch over these patients. And that challenge sort of exists mostly for those autologous therapies, but even the outpatient infrastructure, having the staff that knows how to work with these products can be incredibly challenging. Next is, I think, particularly for the allogeneic therapies here, when you think about these allogeneic therapies, the idea is that, they are easier to administer in a not as, academic setting. The idea of allogeneic is the ability to not give it at the super specialized hospitals, but because of the infrastructure that is also going to be required for those allogeneic cell and gene therapies, you're really going to limit the ability of local hospitals to uptake that product, and really going to result in the university hospitals that are specialized and maybe we want to prioritize for autologous therapies to really also be the only ones administering those allogeneic products. And then the last two here, really across the board, this is going to be a challenge. The first one here is around ancillary services. So when you're thinking about the services beyond just the product cost, so thinking about apheresis, lymphodepletion, things like that, that is still an expense that is associated with the therapy. For example, in the US, government patients there's no reimbursement or payment for the apheresis portion of the cell therapy, which is fine, I think, for most hospitals to take on that loss for the first couple or few patients that they deal with. But once we start seeing large volumes, that becomes quite difficult to plan around and control for in terms of finances. And then the last one, I think, super important in India in particular, is the challenges with affordability to patients. Since there's no guarantee that payers will cover this product through the insurance channel, it's really going to come down to patients being able to afford the treatment, and not just the product itself, but the services that are associated with that, and that can result in potential limited uptake across the centers. Let me go to the next slide. And because of that, and because of all those access threats we just talked about, there's a different need for these therapies compared to what we see when we commercialize standard oncology products or other standard therapeutics. So starting at the top here, in terms of the provider channel, there's a lot more coordination and collaboration that's needed, not just between the manufacturer and the treatment center, but also the treatment center insurance and the manufacturer and insurance. There's a lot more collaboration and understanding of resources and cross-department coordination that's needed. Next, in terms of the payer channel and market access, we really need to educate payers and help them understand what the value of these therapies are compared to the more standard therapeutics. So thinking about their expertise, as well as the sophistication and cost containment priorities. And then these last two are really more of the operations side of things. So thinking about how are we going to get the product from the manufacturing site to the provider site themselves. So really understanding that new supply chain that's going to be in effect. And then lastly, thinking about the coordination of commercial operations. So since there are specialized staff and specialized units that are going to be needed to commercialize these products, how can we help treatment centers be ready to go? We can go to the next slide. And then here at a high level, just wanted to provide additional context around what are some of those strategies to provide. So starting with the provider side, since there's a lot more collaboration that's needed, educating provider sites on what is the standard indication landscape look like right now versus what it could look like with this new therapy that's available. And then also, potentially selecting sites accordingly based on what are their capacity and capabilities. The next one around market access, again, this is more the payer strategy. So understanding what their reaction is to the TPP and access implications associated with that. In terms of the distribution and patient support models, really trying to understand what are opportunities for the manufacturer to support patients, as well as, when it comes to distribution, is there a analog or something that we can leverage that already exists to kind of build off of to build out our CAR-T distribution. And then the last one around commercial operations, like we talked about, there's a lot of specialized staff that's needed. So really trying to understand, is there opportunity to provide a lot more guidance to the provider sites on, these are the people that need to be involved, these are their roles, and this is how often we should be communicating between both the providers and the manufacturer. And this is just a summary of my expertise. Thank you.
Thank you, Pooja. Thank you, Pooja, for that insightful demonstration or presentation on the landscape, the global landscape of cell and gene therapy, and providing us with a view of how the market access and the product would look like. In case you have any questions, feel free to put that in the chat box, and we'll take up questions at the end of all the sessions. I would now like to introduce my next speaker, Murali Ramachandra, who's the CEO of Origin Oncology, a subsidiary of Dr. Reddy's Laboratories, which is focused on developing innovative cancer therapeutics. Prior to his current role, Dr. Ramachandra was the CSO at Origin. He received his PhD from Idaho University and has completed postdoctoral training at DuPont University and University of Kansas Medical Center in USA. He's worked at the National Cancer Institute and the Schering-Plough Research Institute, which is also known as Merck. He has contributed to the discovery and development of 20 clinical stage innovative therapeutics and the first globally approved adenoviral gene therapy product for cancer, Adstiladrin, for bladder cancer. With an overall research experience of more than 30 years, he has co-authored more than 75 scientific publications and is an inventor on 30 granted international patents. It's my pleasure to have Murali take over now. Murali, all over to you.
Thank you, Shridhar, for that kind introduction. So in my presentation, I'll talk about the opportunities for cell and gene therapy in India. So if you move on to the next slide, specifically in this presentation, I'll talk about the CAR-T, which is probably the most widely used cell as well as gene therapy. It's an engineered cell that's being used in cancer therapy. Prior to that, to set the context, I'll talk about the cancer status in India, and then highlight the opportunities for CAR-T therapy, and then maybe eventually talk about India's readiness for CAR-T therapy and what we need to do to be able to fully ready to make these breakthrough therapies available for patients in India. So if you move on to the next slide. So if you look at India, India holds third position in terms of the cancer incidence. It's only after China and USA that India probably stands. This is probably, it may not be the actual estimation because they tend to be an under reporting of cancer incidence, but still I think it highlights that cancer is indeed a significant concern in India. So this is what's shown is 1.4 million. This is the cancer incidence per year. This is the statistics in last year, 2022. So it's expected to go up to 3.25 million 5-year prevalent cases, and mortality in 2022 was about 0.92 million. So if you move on to the next slide. So in spite of having that many cancer patients, Indian patients lack universal access to transformation therapy. When we talk about transformation therapy, definitely CAR-T comes under that category. Majority of the blockbuster medicines and not only CAR-T, but other therapies are not considered high priority by oncologists in India, mainly because of three reasons. First of all, in some of these cases, the incremental gain is relatively small, and there is a high cost of therapy. Most of the innovative therapeutics, as you know, it's significantly more expensive for generics or other therapies. And, and also in many cases, these therapies are effective only in a small subsets of patients. So I think because of that, cancer care in India is associated with significant financial toxicity. So about 80 to 85% of the Indian patients is not covered by health insurance. And even if the health insurance is covering, it's mainly through the government-sponsored insurance schemes. So typically in India, about 65% of the patients, they receive care in private healthcare facilities. Therefore, they face significant out-of-pocket expenditure. So therefore, I think unless we make these therapies affordable, many of the patients in India cannot really afford or cannot really access these transformational therapies. If you move on to the next slide. So, and it's very clear that CAR-T has been widely praised as revolutionary cell immunotherapy. We already talked about, Pooja highlighted many of the approved CAR-T therapies. And what's remarkable about these therapies is the response rate, including the complete response. For example, it can go up to 90% in some of the cancers, such as BALL. So, but what's really prohibitive for patients is in the US, actual therapy cost itself is 4 to 5 crores. And then if you add to the hospitalization cost and other things, it could go more than $1 million, which is completely unaffordable for patients in India. And this is expected to go further by 2028, according to an estimate by IQVIA. The spending in cell therapies is expected to be around 14 billion. So clearly, I think when global patients are accessing these transformational therapies, what can we do to make sure that patients in India can really get these kinds of therapies? So if you move on to the next slide. So I think the major hurdle is the high cost of manufacturing of these cell therapies, at least the approved cell therapies. That's because there is a long process. It takes weeks. First, you have to manufacture, then you have to QC them, then the release, shipment to the hospitals. These involve multiple steps. And so far, what's approved is the autologous that, as Pooja talked about, these are individualized T cells are isolated from patient blood and then engineered in the lab, and then it's shipped back to the hospitals and they are administered. They are difficult to manufacture at scale. And aim of these therapies should be, we have to make sure that these therapies are scalable. Secondly, it should be less time consuming and also to be cost effective. So in the next slide. So if you look at various APAC countries, here what we have shown is, first, there are innovative archetypes. These includes countries like Japan, Australia, or Korea, where there is a strong state of readiness across multiple dimensions for CAR-T or other gene therapies. Then you have advancing archetypes such as China, Singapore, or Taiwan, whereas countries such as India is still in an initializing archetype where there is still significant gaps in their preparedness for CAR-T cell therapy. So specifically, if you look at various parameters such as intellectual property and regulatory considerations, there is still substantial needs to be done. Same way, commercial maturity of the life sciences industry in India, medical infrastructure preparedness, treatment adoption of awareness, funding, access and reimbursement, and provider treatment capacity and supporting operations. So clearly, in all these parameters, India is still, I think, it's in the initializing archetype. So therefore, the biggest obstacle for expanding is the cost. So if you move on to the next slide. So therefore, we need to come up with strategies to ensure that patients in India can access affordable and high quality cancer care, mainly, I think, in this presentation, CAR-T. So that's highlighted in the next slide. So I think to make sure that we can develop effectively CAR-T therapy and administer CAR-T therapies to patients, we need to consider various commercial aspects early on in the development process. First of all, we need to look at the commercial viability. This helps in attracting and de-risking potential investors with the likely returns they anticipate by investing in these kinds of breakthrough therapy. we need to make sure that we implement proven demand forecasting and planning approaches, determine speed to market penetration. We need to evaluate how the economies of scale in India can help in recuperating the investment or getting the right returns on the investment. There has to be knowledge on regulatory process to know that what to avoid during development, to delay or to avoid untimely or not getting it approved in a timely manner. And I think in the middle, what I've highlighted is the manufacturing. So clearly, I think this is where a lot of opportunities for Indian companies. So if you look at to start with the currently approved autologous therapies, so we can simply, I think we need to make sure that initially we understand the biology at a small scale and then ramp up scale to manufacture. There has to be substantial skill building, knowledge ramp up, and standardization. I think more importantly, with the current approved CAR T therapies, the most of the expense comes from raw materials and consumables, and these are all imported from Western countries, so they are extremely expensive. So if we can encourage make in India raw materials and consumables, some of these costs can be significantly reduced. We need to also look at flexible modular manufacturing, GMP in a box kind of solution. So these are with approved CAR T therapies. Parallelly, we need to look at the next generation CAR T or CAR NK. This is mainly to look at allogeneic therapy. We can look at viral vector alternatives. Can we look at cheaper delivery systems and simplified supply chain and economies of scale, especially that would happen with an allogeneic therapy. It could be NK, it could be delta gamma T cells. And can we also think of CAR T generation in vivo? This is essentially directly injecting vector and then having CAR T produced in vivo inside the patient's body. I think there are more and more efforts towards looking at rapid CAR T systems instead of typical 8 to 10 days. Can we look at 2 to 3 days of manufacturing that will substantially reduce the cost of consumables or the consumable needed for the manufacturing and automation to bring down the cost. Parallelly, we have to make sure that there is commercial efficiency. This is attractive for investors and companies to start working on these breakthrough therapies. We need to look at international partnership to foster medical tourism to attract patients from large economies. We need to demonstrate value to payer models of large economies to support international reimbursements. I think if we can make sure that the CAR T therapies are administered with the same quality as in the Western geographies, probably we should be able to convince payers in the outside of India to be able to reimburse those expenses. And possibly we need to move towards outpatient treatment to lower the cost. I think it would be possible if you were to make next generation therapies much more safer so that they can be administered in outpatient treatment mode. So in the next slide. So essentially, I think we need to look at the entire ecosystem. There has to be significant efforts in instituting various policies to make sure that it is conducive for CAR T and other cell and gene therapies. We need to look at Center of Excellence for Cell Therapy, not only for developing technologies, but also to train skilled workforce. We need to incentivize companies for raw materials as well as manufacturing of CAR T. Incentivization could be funding, tax benefits. We need to streamline regulations. There has to be clear guidelines, dedicated regulatory pathways, etc. And also reimbursement, Pooja already highlighted. And also there has to be guidance pathway and improvements in infrastructure in the hospital to be able to administer these therapies. I think with this kind of improvement in ecosystem, we will certainly make CAR T much more affordable, much more universally available in India. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Murali, for that insightful presentation on the opportunities for CAR T therapies in India. There are a number of questions that have come up on the chat box. We'll definitely ask those at the end of the session. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rahul Purwar, who is the founder of ImmunoAct, the first company from India to receive DCGI approval for its CAR T therapy. Dr. Purwar has a distinguished academic background. He holds a PhD in molecular medicine from Hannover Medicine School, Germany, and an MSc in biochemistry from the University of Lucknow. His professional journey in the academic space, also moved from Hanover in Germany to Harvard in the US, and also as a research scientist with Immunogen in Waltham, Massachusetts. He is the co-founder of ImmunoAct in Mumbai. He drives strategic initiatives through the accelerated process and clinical development and manufacturing, which has not only led to the successful market authorization of the first CAR T cell therapy from India, but is one that is also fully indigenous to India and distinguished by a superior safety profile. I would now request Rahul to take us through the case study of the first CAR T cell therapy from India. Rahul, over to you.
Thank you so much, Shridhar, for the kind introduction. And really is honored to be here. I'm very happy to discuss about the case study. Can I have my first slide, please? Yeah, next slide. So what I will be talking about the first Indian CAR T, which recently got the approval and launched by our Honorable President. And this is about for the relapse and refractory B-cell malignancies. And I will discuss how we have created from R&D to translational, going towards clinical and ultimately market authorization. And next slide. I think Murali and I think the previous speaker already told you about really this CAR T-cell therapy, which is an revolution and is led by Carl June from University of Pennsylvania. It's an intent to cure platform. It's really transformational therapy, as Murali was pointing out. And it's a personalized medicine. So the way it works is patient come to the clinic. The blood is drawn from the patient. T cells are isolated in the laboratory. They genetically modify in a very clean environment called GMP environment. And once they genetically modify, these T cells become cancer-fighting cells. Then we grow them in enough quantity and then ultimately reinfuse them back into the patient. And these cells, these genetically modified cancer-fighting cells, they then go to the cancer patient and eliminate the tumor cell. Next slide. If you see in Indian context, the first CAR T with CD19 positive CAR T cell, just like Kymriah, we have here in India NextCAR19. It works against leukemia and lymphomas. So NHL and leukemia, both if you see, combined almost we have 1 lakh patients a year. It could be underreported, patients may be higher, but this is the number which is approximate number we published. Out of 1 lakh patient per year, almost there will be around 20 to 40% relapse. So at least minimum patient is, if you consider, if not 40,000, at least 20,000 cases are there for first CAR T, which is approved per year in our country. Right now, majority of them treated by chemo, and once chemo also relapse and refractory, BMT is bone marrow transplant, another option, where in our country there are almost 100 plus centers, but less than 5% of the patient get BMT. In fact, 20,000 need, and very relatively very few patients only get it. Right? So Indian context, need is huge. So in this part of the world, we have a need. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in if we see across the world, if you just put a line across this world map, you see global north, which US, Canada, in fact, our neighbor China. Here you see there's a lot happening in the CAR T and cell and gene therapy space. But if you see below, all these continents in different countries, you see hardly they have access of this curative platform. So it's really a global demand supply kind of mismatch, where you have highest number of patients, you don't have these therapies. However, where you have the patient, you have at least fewer patients, you have the availability of the treatment. And this is really a huge unmet need, as I was mentioning, that we have so many number of patients. And the major obstacle why we do not have these drugs or these life-saving medicine is the cost. And of course, complexity, which previous speakers also alluded to. Next slide, please. And because there is a very huge need, there is an opportunity. I think there's several billions of dollars market there, but how to tap in this opportunity, I think that's the very interesting thing, how to make that entire ecosystem, Indian ecosystem ready, which all these points Murali was mentioning, all those 6 points, how we make that ecosystem in India ready so we can tap in this opportunity even better. And next slide. If you see, there's so many cell and gene therapy in different indications, right from hemat, onc, derm, neuro, opthal, muscle, immunodeficiency, aesthetic. So many cell and gene therapies are approved by US FDA. And fortunately, in India also, we have got this NextCar 19 approved in last year. Okay, so India has, at least with this first product, what we can say that we have a framework. I am not sure how ready it is, but at least we have a framework. We have an ecosystem where this kind of platform can be developed, evaluated by regulatory, and can be approved. So this is, I think, we should take a proud moment that at least we have something here which led to the first CAR-T approved in our country. The framework exists, right? So next slide. And all these approved therapy here, only 6 I mentioned, but there are now more. But all these therapies are extremely, extremely expensive. $500,000, and then you put another $500,000 for clinical management, and that becomes even almost $1 million treatment per patient. Next slide. And that's the place we have an opportunity to innovate and make it affordable and improve the access. And I think here we have many examples. Our recent example going to Mars at a very, very low cost. So India has the potential to innovate a very high impact technology at lower cost. And we have delivered in different domains. You call it our mass, or you call IT industry, even pharma industry. And I am sure in cell and gene therapy, we can do similar innovation as well. Next slide. And this is my favorite slide. I took it from Dr. Hasmukh Jain, that many times lower cost, when we make these technologies affordable, it really does not mean the low quality. And here you see the real-time example. This is the Fairfield Inn by Marriott in New York, and it's St. Regis in Marriott, which is another Marriott hotel in Mumbai, and see the difference. And it's same cost. Cost is same, and you can see the difference. And that's what we have to bring from India, high quality at affordable cost. And this is a very good example where we can say that lower cost does not mean low quality. We can bring very high quality product at lower cost. Next slide. And in our journey, the entire objective was 2 objectives, right? One, make it affordable and make it at scale, because we want to have a big social impact where these life-saving treatment can treat many, many patients. And our efforts were, because I am still in academic setting along with my entrepreneurial journey, create an ecosystem in India for the CAR-T cell therapy and other cell and gene therapy platform. Next slide. So that's what we have collaborated with IIT Bombay, Tata Hospital, NIH and NCI was our knowledge partner. ImmunoAct remained translational and commercial vehicle. And we, all of us, Terry Fry, Murali, Steve, Dr. Hasmukh Jain, and Dr. Narula, we all worked together from last 10, 11 years. It's truly a global collaboration that led to a high quality, affordable CAR T-cell therapy in our country. Next slide. And this was the work we published that is a novel construct, novel product. So if you ask me what is the novel component in the CAR T journey, actually the product is novel, the construct is novel. And if you want to have more details, this is the preclinical product development paper we published. And this is published in American Association of Cancer AACR Journal called Molecular Cancer Therapeutics. And in fact, on the cover page, you see this protein, which is our CAR construct of Indian CAR, and the patent is also granted. Next slide. So our CAR is unique, tested extensively in the laboratory, in the ex vivo settings, as well in the preclinical model. The patents, all patents are granted in India, and US patents are pending. And then we were first in the clinic and started our clinical work. Next slide. First patient was treated was the pediatric patient, and then adult patient was treated. So now here is the scale what you can feel. Hardly in less than in a year time, we already treated 150 plus patients. And these are remarkable numbers if you see in cell and gene therapy space. 150 patients have already been treated. I think next 1 year, probably we will treat another 300 to 400 patients. And these are the numbers which can be increased further as we increase our scale. So India can certainly make a huge impact in the cell and gene therapy by ensuring affordable, high quality CAR T-cell at scale. And you see the response rate, 70% response rate overall, which is as good as any other CAR T available on this planet Earth, right? And this was also good, a good profile with the toxicity. Next slide. So in brief, entire journey of last 10, 11 years of this development, it took us long. So I always say we were not just making the CAR T, we were also paving the road in India, because we had to create a lot of different things. Create an entire ecosystem is a difficult task, but it took us 10, 11 years. I am sure the second product will not take that long, which will come very soon. But the first product we started in 2013, did all the 3-4 years we were working on preclinical laboratory work, then performed next 1 or 2 years preclinical and translational work. Then ultimately we worked on the clinical trial of different phases. And finally, we got the clinical trial approval. Next, please. And now we are serving, after the market authorization, we are serving entire country. You see the logistics. We were really, really worried that how the logistic will happen. Clinical trial is okay in 3-4 different centers. But here you can see we are serving many cities in the country. Ahmedabad, Surat in the west, Pune, Nashik again in the west. So west region we are covering all these cities. In south, it is available in Hyderabad, Chennai, Kochi, Bengaluru. In the east, it's mainly the east. We haven't reached yet. I think we haven't treated patients. But Delhi and Lucknow in the north. So we are treating many places right now, the patients. Almost total patient, if you see, we have treated with 150. Next slide. And our aim is how we can take this high quality make in India CAR, which is affordable to those regions which do not have the CAR T access. And I hope that soon the trial will start, most likely in Latin America. And then hopefully we will go in different places. Next. So with this, I really acknowledge the people behind it who worked very hard to make it happen. The IIT Bombay, everybody in IIT Bombay, Tata Hospital, who is a very solid partner, Tata Hospital and NIH, where these folks, without these folks, it was not possible to have Indian CAR. Carl June, who has, although he invented and gave the CAR to Novartis, he was very happy to collaborate with us and help and guide us on the CAR T development in India. Satwa Nilapu and Nitin Jain from MD Anderson, they're always there for any clinical inputs we require. So really huge thanks to them to ensure our clinical trial runs with the very high quality work, and all the funding agencies and Lawrence Lab who helped us in translating the work, because first work was done in academic setting, but with the vision of Lawrence Lab in investing in us at that stage when we were really at a academic stage, their visionary leadership, I think, helped. And I think this will help other industry player in India to invest in innovation that happens in our country. With this, thank you so much, everyone. I will be happy to take any question if you may have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Purwar. That was a fantastic presentation, and I would like to congratulate you and the entire team at ImmunoAct for the journey that you have taken and the product that you have delivered. I'm sure every single patient who has benefited from this is thanking you from the bottom of their heart. I've had a number of questions in the chat box, and I think it's going to take quite some time to answer all of those, and I'm sure the panelists are going to be kept busy by that. So my first question, Pooja, is to you. How many gene therapy medicinal products are currently authorized commercially, and in which territories? Most importantly, in the rest of the world, USA and Europe.
Yeah, so there's quite a bit. I think there's about 6 CAR Ts that are authorized, and I mean quite a few gene therapies. I would say maybe less than 10 and for the gene therapies. In the US, obviously, there's a lot more availability of products. I think most recently there's been an allogeneic cell therapy approval in the EU, the Abvalo. That's a newest one so far, but I think right now top of mind for the US is definitely the sickle cell and TDT ex vivo gene therapies. There's been, obviously that is a rare population, but not really rare. So the cost implications, and that is something that I think both the provider sites and the healthcare industry as a whole is trying to figure out how to deal with. Yeah.
Thanks, Pooja. Murali, the next question is to you. What are the requirements of preclinical studies for the cell and gene therapies? Are they similar to your antibodies and small molecules? Murali, you seem to be on mute.
I think there are similarities as well as there are differences as well. Unlike small molecule, I think here, because I don't think you need to do that many preclinical studies. What's critical is to establish the quality and make sure that your molecule is efficacious. Safety, many of the preclinical models may not really mimic the safety issue that you would see in the clinic. And there are a lot of in vitro studies, whether it's the tumor cell killing, those are the kinds of studies you do. I think in a way, probably manufacturing and making sure that the quality is maintained, those are probably bigger hurdles than characterizing, I would say, compared to typical small molecules and understanding their toxicity and pharmacology. Rahul, do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think, Rahul, there are a number of questions that are on the regulatory aspects. And I think I'm going to try to summarize those questions into one single question for you. You've taken this journey through the Indian regulator and the Indian regulatory setup. What are the kind of challenges that you faced while doing this? I can see the timelines from the time you dosed your first patient to actually getting a commercialization was very short as compared to many of the small molecule or antibody-based therapies. So would like to know about your experience with the regulator and how smooth or difficult it has been, and what could be done to actually make that process easier for the next generation of CAR T therapies.
So, see, this is an evolving field, and regulators are as unaware about it. Like they are also just like us. They are learning. Regulators are learning. We are learning what should be the regulation. In fact, not just in India, even in US or EMA, which are very mature regulators, they are also learning and coming up with the new guidelines. And so the regulation is evolving. But the reason why the pathway of first dosing till commercialization was short, it was because of a couple of reasons. First, it's an rare disease and accelerated approvals are granted because it's a transformational therapy, right? So you don't need to go a complete phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4 trial before the approvals. And you also, in India at least right now, because there was no product on, or even if there are 1 or 2 products maximum, you don't need to have a several cohort in your clinical trial, unlike other molecule where you have to run multiple phases of clinical trial, plus you should have a standard of care arm. In this case, there's no standard of care arm as such, because anything, whatever exists, CAR T is way beyond better, right? Somewhere like, as Murali was mentioning, in ALL, response can go as high as 90%. So ALL, it really works fantastic. Lymphoma, yes, 40 to 50%. But again, these responses are really remarkable, which has never been seen in oncology field. So because this is a rare disease, numbers are less, what rare orphan disease status it gets. Second, it is a transformational treatment, which is an intent to cure platform. I think those are the major factors that led to everywhere in the world, not just in India, the accelerated approval.
Thank you, Rahul. Pooja, next question back to you. What is the vein-to-vein timeline currently for a cell and gene therapy? Which means, as soon as you take the blood out and put until the time you put the blood back in or the cells back in, what is the timeline, globally acceptable timeline today? What should it be ideally?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we think about the CAR Ts, I think that vein-to-vein time really is between 3 to 4 weeks. That is it acceptable? I think is really depends on the situation of the patient and where they are in terms of their treatment journey. Right now, we do have earlier line approvals for the CAR T products. So they used to be 5th line plus or 4th line plus. Now they're being treated in the 2nd and 3rd line. So in those situations, definitely that 3 to 4 week timeline was acceptable. For the later line patients, most of these patients are very, very sick. Are they going to be able to stand it and handle the bridging therapy until it's time to be treated with the CAR T is really, dependent on that patient's health status. So for the CAR Ts, around 3 to 4 weeks, it's still that. I wouldn't say that is the ideal timeline for manufacturing, but that is what it is at this point. When it comes to the sickle cell autologous cell gene therapies, TDT and sickle cell ones, we're looking at a manufacturing timeline of anywhere from 3 to 6 months, which is, a very long time for manufacturing in general. And there's a lot more delays and challenges associated with those therapies as well, because now you're looking at the actual collection themselves and the quality of collection. So even if you collect the patients once, which is what you typically need for CAR Ts, that's typically not enough for sickle cell disease patients. You have to at least collect twice and hope that that's enough. And if not, there could even be a 3rd collection. And then once you get into manufacturing, the way and scaling of this manufacturing, I think we all touched on it a little bit. A lot of the manufacturing for commercialization of products has really been just scaling up whatever the lab manufacturing has been, and that is not really ideal when you're treating not one patient but a ginormous patient population. So that is something that I think a lot of manufacturers need to keep in mind, that your lab manufacturing works for small patient volumes, but when you're thinking about commercializing and treating patients across the country, you really have to think about your manufacturing and put time and effort into scaling back processes, figuring out is there ways to streamline that process as well.
Thank you. Murali, in terms of the clinical trial design for some of these innovative therapies, like CAR-T or CAR-NK or the CRISPR-Cas9 therapies, what would you think should be an ideal clinical trial design for the development pathway for a cell and gene therapy, if you take any of the cancers?
So I think Rahul already sort of touched upon that. Unlike other therapies, here, because of the expected response rate or the expected response, trials tend to be smaller. So again, I think if we can show that kind of response, so obviously then you may not need to do a head-to-head comparison with current standard of care. But I think as more and more CAR-T therapies are approved, you may need to show that advantage of one over the other. That may come, but right now we are not in that stage because still probably some of the earlier approved therapies are just in use. But let's say as we start getting newer generation, whether it's allogeneic therapies or vector-based therapies, then we start need to comparing it. And also there, it may be possible that the response rate may not be as high as autologous. They may be off-the-shelf therapies, much more convenient, vein-to-vein time is not a concern, but response may not be as high. But still, I think it could be very useful for patients. For example, here we talked about ALL, it could be 90%, it could be maybe half of that. Still, I think in those cases, we may need to start looking at the other therapies such as bispecific or ADCs and see what really makes sense. And if you can, in those cases, my guess would be you have to do some traditional therapies. But I see that even if the response rate in that range, there is a significant value for patients. I don't think every cell therapy has to give you the response rate of 90% or so. I think more than response rate, I'm sure in the coming days, there will be a lot more emphasis on overall survival, how long these are doable, especially considering these are really expensive. I think patients will start expecting that this has to be almost like a cure. So that's where I think overall survival is going to be probably going to be one of the key endpoints, which is not at this present time. But I think that's what is going to happen in the coming days. Do we really see the benefit that's really long lasting compared to other therapies? Because if they have to spend that kind of money. Shridhar?
Looks like some issue with Sridhar's internet connection.
Yeah, so looks like.
I think I can read, Murali, there's a question in the chat box. In the situation of, this is for you, in the situation of in-licensing of technology, does the out-licensing company allow the in-licensing company to manufacture the vector locally? Or is it mandatory to purchase the vector from the out-licensing company?
Oh, so shall I answer that? So I think that depends on the kind of agreement you would have. Obviously, I think in the example that we heard from Rahul, it was fully indigenously developed. But I think in any agreement, having a full control on the vector supply is probably will go a long way. So in an agreement, even if you were to in-license a vector, if you can have the flexibility to manufacture with a full control, whether it's in India, then I think that gives a lot of flexibility because then you don't have to face some of the issues. You're not at the mercy of the companies or the institution that has licensed the product. That would be ideal scenario. I think it would be possible. It depends on the kind of arrangement, kind of agreement that one would make. But the preferred would be to have full control on the vector manufacturing as opposed to fully dependent on the source of the in-licensed vector.
Thanks, Rahul, for filling in with that question. I had a power outage briefly, but my next question to you is to you. What are the major bottlenecks that you see for commercialization of a CAR-T therapy in India? And what would be the price point at which you think this would become an affordable therapy for most patients?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. And commercialization of these kind of therapies in our country is even more difficult. And the major reason is socioeconomic heterogeneity in our nation, right? There are people who can afford at any price. Then there are some who can afford at certain price, and there are who cannot afford at all, right? And these therapies are so expensive that many patients who may get it, they have very high expectations too. And as Murali was pointing out, and other speaker was also pointing out, they are, again, not like every patient will get benefit out of it. So how to convince a patient to take these very expensive therapy, right? It's a challenge. And challenge not just to patient, to educate the patient, and how we can convince the physician to prescribe it, and then how physicians convince the patient. So I think it will happen. I think a lot of education and training will go in it. I think a lot of efforts will go where we have to set the expectation right from the physician who is providing the treatment, and also to the patient whose expectations should be correctly set. So this is like work in progress, Sridhar. I don't think we will have immediate answer and immediate solution for it. It will be work in progress in our country even more. And there's no one set price point where everybody can afford. At least in our country, certainly not. So there would be patient who will go to hospital like Tata Hospital or AIMS, mainly government type of hospitals, where I think pricing would be different. Then there would be many people privately owned hospital. So depending on their, I think, comfort level, people will choose different type of hospitals. So I think there would be a differential pricing. And for industry point of view, we have to, I think, at some point we have to think about our investors as well as our social impact. So that balance we have to make, that how this Indian ingenuity or Indian thing we bring in picture. So we create good social impact. At the same time, we do not disappoint our investors. So I think there's a lot of learning will go in this.
That's a question that each and every entrepreneur faces, and is probably the most difficult question. I completely agree with you on that. Murali, next question to you on, with a lot of these CAR therapies coming in, not necessarily only CAR T, what are the different therapeutic areas or diseases that could potentially get covered with treatments like this?
So I think gene therapy, when it started, obviously idea was to replace the missing gene or the defective gene. I think now it's coming back. Probably I would say about 15 or 20 years ago, it was a peak, and that time there were a lot of challenges, probably was not anticipated. For example, immunogenicity to the vectors and all of that, it sort of went down. Now I think there is a resurgence in the interest in gene therapy to replace defective genes, or I think we have seen the results of those. Many of the genetic genes, there are patients who are deaf now able to hear. So I think there are remarkable progress. So in those cases, obviously, I think what has helped us making sure that there is no immunogenicity towards the vector. That's where I think there was a question that I saw in the chat box, AAV, for example. I think there are vector systems that can now persist for a long duration of time. In those cases, I think those kind of vectors are fine. Coming to cancer, so other than CAR T, obviously, if you have to use some of those kinds of genes, delivery for any gene therapy, I think it's going to be the key challenge. Do we have the right delivery system? I think I briefly touched upon, ultimately, I think what would make this gene therapy really affordable, even for CAR T, for example, rather than injecting engineered cells, if you can inject a vector that can seek the T cells, generate CAR T in vivo, that would be the most ideal. But for that, you need to have the vector system that has the tropism towards T cells, make the CAR T cells in the body, then you don't have to worry about manufacturing. And you have to do that with a greater efficiency. So that's the challenge. But there are already some publications coming out. I think that's the future. Eventually, if we can make it, it won't be any different than compared to, say, an antibody-based therapeutics or a small molecule-based therapeutics. It'll be in a small vial. These vectors are injected. If they can seek out T cells or if they can modify NK cells, you have the modified CAR-NK, CAR-T to destroy the cancer cells. I think that would be the future, and that's where we need to go. That's where I think there has to be a lot more. When I talked about center of excellence, we need to also be in the cutting edge research. I think one thing is working with the current sort of established therapies, but that's the future, and that's what eventually will make these therapies truly affordable.
Thank you, Murali. Pooja, next question to you. What has been the history with players in the EU and the US? And are there any ex-EU and US markets which are proving easy to obtain reimbursements?
That is another great question. Easy to obtain reimbursement is very subjective. I think when we're looking at the US, there is coverage and there is reimbursement. Is it easy to achieve? I wouldn't say that. I think there's a lot of things that payers put into place when it comes to criteria for eligibility. They really make hospitals sort of jump through hoops in order to get that reimbursement. We have a couple of different payer types in the US. We have our private insurance as well as the government one. For private insurance, it's a lot more standardized where there will be reimbursement as long as they have negotiations with the payer upfront. They'll have discussions. They'll sign off on contracting that says they will be reimbursed. For government patients, it's very different. So usually for government, they don't have to go through any sort of conversation beforehand. They will just submit for reimbursement, and then the government payer ultimately decides whether or not they'll reimburse. And in those situations, that's really when, as I brought up in my discussion, that's really where the risk lies for a lot of the hospitals in the US. It's really around the government insurance patients. When we look at the EU, I think there it's a little bit different. I think reimbursement is a little bit more challenging in the outpatient setting compared to the inpatient setting. So we'll see therapies like Luxturna, for example, which is an outpatient therapy in the US, where it's like an hour and a half procedure. It doesn't take a lot of time. They'll actually have the patient stay 1 to 2 days just because reimbursement and the funds at which are reimbursing those therapies are more sustainable in the inpatient setting. So is there reimbursement being received across these, markets? Yes, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is the ideal method, right? So if we're thinking about like Europe, for example, those outpatient therapies that are being done inpatient, now you're using more of your capacity. You're using an inpatient bed for a patient that really should have been sent off in like 1 day. So that's important sort of a caveat to think about, that even though there is reimbursement, that doesn't mean that it's sustainable, and it doesn't mean that it's enough. Another thing that the European markets do as well is negotiations with the manufacturer on pricing. So the pricing is a little bit lower than what it is in the US. But again, the manufacturer has to be willing to do the negotiation for those. And for the most part, I think at this point, we've definitely seen all the manufacturers sort of step up to the plate and do the negotiations, but that's not always, going to be the case. We see that not happen in other therapeutic areas with, monoclonal antibodies, things like that, where they don't want to erode the price.
Thanks, Pooja. I have one more question to both Murali and Rahul. In your experience, what are the side effects of CAR T cell therapy? And can you touch upon the recent findings of secondary cancers after CAR T cell therapy with some of the agents that have already been approved? Murali, you want to take it first?
I think obviously CAR T, the major side effect is the cytokine release syndrome or the cytokine release, and also some of the neurotoxicity. But I think compared to probably the first patients who received CAR T, there is a good management algorithm that's already worked out. So I don't think that's been a problem, at least in the recent past. And also with some of the newer vectors, what I read about is clearly the CRS and the neurotoxicity is significantly minimal, almost non-existent. So I think what it clearly says that these are manageable effects, and it can be addressed either based on the vector system that you use, based on the activation domain in your construct, car construct. There are so many elements that can make these vectors much more safer. I'm sure Rahul's publication also talks about some of the elements they brought in their vector system. Maybe he'll touch upon. In terms of the T cell based cancers and all of that, again, I think if you weigh that are reported with CAR T therapies, especially I think CD19 CAR T, or I believe, I don't recall whether it's CD19 or BCMA, but clearly those are, if you look at the risk benefit ratio, this is still a significantly small proportion. I'm sure if you look at patients who are getting benefited, that's probably a extremely small proportion of the risk. But we still need to keep that in mind. I'm sure we will get a better understanding in the coming years to see that we can even minimize or completely avoid those effects. Rahul?
Yeah. No, I think what is said is, I think, very nicely said by Murali. CRS and neurotoxicity, these are two major side effects which can lead to some fatality. But in recently, it has not been that bad. They all have been manageable. They are reversible side effects. In fact, with our CAR T, surprisingly, we haven't seen neurotoxicity at all. There was no ICANS. So only CRS we have seen in grade 3 in fewer patients, but majority of them had grade 1 or grade 2, which are not difficult to manage. And similar, because this probably one thing which we speculate, we do not have 100% proof for it. We just speculate that this may be due to the humanization of the construct. Other constructs are mouse origin, murine origin. Probably our one is the humanized construct. Again, it is not 100% proof for that. Could be the one of the reason why we have less toxicity, because one of the two papers, one is from China and another from UPenn, Kaljun lab, also have shown that humanization reduced the toxicity profile. So this could be one of the reasons. And about your recent secondary cancer, I think there are very good papers published by, I think, certain consortium, where a group of scientists did extensive retrospective studies, analyzed thousands of the patient. In fact, one came out by UPenn group again, Bruce Levine and Carl June. They have put a paper, I think, in Nature or Nature Medicine, where they have clearly said that we should be a little bit more cautious. Still, we cannot prove that there is a causal relationship, that the really CAR T caused the secondary cancer. It's mainly in the BCMA CAR T yet. But it could be that these patients are predisposed for the secondary cancer, because they have analyzed the number of patients who did not receive the CAR T, but still developed T cell cancer. So the number of patients, they simply took those who did not receive CAR T, those who received CAR T, and then checked the frequency of T cell lymphoma. It was almost similar. So 100% causal relationship is not yet, I think, proved. But again, this is a good point for further research. I think we should be careful and develop more, I think, less toxic and safer therapy for our patients.
Thank you, Rahul. And I have a last question again to both of you. How does one start a new venture in the cell and gene therapy space in India with limited funds?
I think, Rahul, you can take it.
Doesn't have limited funds, right? Murali doesn't have limited funds, so that question doesn't go to him, right? Right.
So
Rahul,
yeah,
you
Rahul, you can take it.
I don't want to create more competition, but but yeah, I think the good thing is, in our country now we have a good ecosystem, and there's a lot of good science happening around. A lot of young motivated people are there who wants to do something really good, and ecosystem is there. I think there are so many incubators are there in different cities with different institute. Like, for example, there was a time when IITs will only entertain the faculty members and their students for the incubation. But now I think most of the incubators, they allow with outside people. If you have good ideas, you can go and incubate your company. So I think ecosystem is there. And I think I think good environment. There's government supports. I think entrepreneur like Murali also, they fund a lot of good research. I think there are so many different companies, philanthropist, I think angel investor. I think there is an environment created, probably not as good as we want, but things are there and they're improving each day. So definitely young people and everybody should now, I think about if you have good ideas, why not?
Thank you, Rahul. And I think there's been a significant amount of interaction and knowledge sharing as part of this webinar. I want to thank all three of you panelists, Pooja, Murali, and Rahul, for taking the time and making some excellent presentations and patiently doing the Q&A. I also want to thank my team at IPA and at Citeline who have worked behind the scenes to make this happen. Thank you all very much. And please do give us a feedback on the webinar. And there is a link in the chat box which you can use to give us your feedback. We would really love to hear from you on what you would like to see as possible topics that should be covered as part of this series, which could be of importance to the biomedical fraternity in India. Once again, thanking all of you and signing off. Goodbye.
Thank you.